landscape and the increasingly compelling force of Scotland's independence movement. So what I noted here is that in 1989, Stephen Kendrick and David McCrone argued that the establishment of Scotland as a separate unit of economic management in popular perception made Scotland an ideological category largely incompatible with conservative English, British rhetoric as employed by Margaret Thatcher. This cold climate, as they called it, corresponded to a conflict between economic and ideological factors which failed to be acknowledged by the Conservatives and ultimately led to the collapse of the Conservative vote in Scotland in the late 90s. The dominance of England in the UK political system before it was offset by an asymmetrical system of devolution in 1999 reinforced the belief that English voters and politicians were imposing right-wing economic policies ill-suited to Scotland's needs, an argument which was repeated by both Labour and the SNP for many years. Maria Sobolewska and Robert Ford have more recently argued that this narrative has helped to link together left-wing economic ideology with Scottish nationalism in the minds of Scottish voters. This has allowed the SNP to define themselves as more effective defenders of Scottish interests than a Labour party they claimed focused on England. New Labour's rightwards shift to the centre of the political spectrum and time in government at Westminster solidified the idea that Labour neither represented the left or Scottish interests, and the party was in turn caught in the storms of a cold climate. Despite a return to the left under Jeremy Corbyn, the Scottish Party was unable to overcome the shift in its political identity. And yet research on Scottish voting preferences in the last 2 decades has suggested that the core valence consideration is an ability to stand up for Scotland. Now, in fact, the legitimacy of Scottish Labour as a party representative of the Scottish people has been called into question for much of its recent history, not only by disgruntled members of the Scottish electorate and political commentators, but also by Labour members and leaders themselves. The much publicised resignation of former Scottish Labour leader Joan Lamont following the 2014 independence referendum, for instance, as she accused the Labour leadership of treating Scottish Labour as, I quote, a branch office, was widely regarded as proof that the party was just no longer the best placed to defend Scotland's distinctive interests, and that it was tied too closely to UK wider interests. The immediate post-devolution period was thus marked overall by the difficulties entailed by the paradoxical centralisation of the organisation and structure of the party in a decentralised political environment. And this had repercussions on its leadership, policies, and recruitment pool, but also crucially to its image as a Scottish party. Now, Scotland's political landscape is characterised by a broad centre-left consensus, with several parties of the left and centre-left competing over the best social democratic and welfarist policies to serve Scotland's distinctive social and economic interests. So this means that if a party is not considered the best placed to serve Scotland's interests, well, there are several other alternatives on the left and centre-left of the political spectrum. So consequently, the position of a given party's policies on the traditional left-right spectrum is less prevalent than that party's ability to effectively represent Scotland's interests. The SNP were therefore able to mobilise public opinion against Scottish Labour's ties to the new Labour governments in Westminster in the early years of devolution, and supplant Labour thereafter as the party considered to best serve Scotland's interests and present the most effective opposition to the Conservative government's austerity policies. Now, this trend was, moreover, reinforced in the aftermath of the 2014 independence referendum. Scottish Labour's role in the Better Together No campaign further damaged its image, and its dithering unionism failed to capture the majority of no voters, increasingly attracted to the Scottish Conservatives' more assertive brand of unionism in a now polarised political debate. This polarisation was given a further dimension with Brexit, as the overlap between European and constitutional allegiances reinforced the divide between a pro-European, pro-independence SNP and a pro-Brexit unionist Scottish Conservative Party. And this left other parties struggling to assert their voices. So in this paper, I'll contend that Scottish Labour failed to carve out a clear identity for itself and adapt to the challenges posed by first devolution and the shift in public mood over Scotland's independence. So we'll first examine the structural reasons for Scottish Labour's decline. And then this will lead us to consider the impact of devolution on the Scottish Labour Party as it grappled with those two contradictory forces exerted by a traditionally centralised party on the one hand and a devolved environment on the other hand. And finally, I'll argue that Labour's ambivalent approach to both Scottish independence and Brexit, so key issues associated with the defence of Scottish interests by the electorate, actually on both ends of the spectrum, has hurt the party's ability to attract support. Right, well, first, if we are to question the structural reasons for Scottish Labour's decline, this will probably lead us all the way back to its formation. The Scottish Labour Party has deep roots in Scotland's radical history, and its origins lay with the party founded by Keir Hardie and Robert Cunningham Graham in 1888. It was absorbed by the Independent Labour Party in 1893 and then merged with the wider trade union movement and other socialist bodies, such as the Social Democratic Federation, the Fabian Society in 1900. When the Labour Representation Committee was formed. It was finally rebranded as the Labour Party 6 years later, was able to draw much of its support in Scotland through the period of mass industrial unrest referred to as Red Clydeside, the anti-war movement and the Glasgow rent strikes, which contributed to the development of the labour movement and the radicalisation of the Scottish working class. Now, this radical past was later refuelled in the 1980s and 1990s with anti-Thatcherism, the anti-poll tax, civil disobedience movement, and the pro-devolutionist movement, which continued to feed the idea of a more collectivist, egalitarian, and radical Scottish political landscape, which the Scottish Labour Party was able to draw upon to present itself as the party that spoke for Scotland and to establish itself until 2007 as the dominant force in Scottish politics. Although the Labour Party was initially organised as a conglomerate of affiliated bodies, it became a centralised body after the 1918 Party Conference, when it adopted a national membership scheme and a constitutional framework for a network of constituency and branch parties which operated more as branches of the central office in the regions rather than actual autonomous regional offices. And indeed, if regional branches of the Labour Party had their own conferences and executives, they had few powers and were strictly discouraged from formulating or even discussing policies that pertained to wider British national interests or international interests. Until 1972, when the ban was lifted and the Scottish Labour Party, on the Scottish Conference actually, was able to discuss wider British issues, though not yet adopt an official position on nor discuss international issues. Debates were thus limited to framing advice on Scottish domestic policy and were further restrained by the need to support decisions made by the Labour Party's National Executive Committee and its National Conference. And yet, the unitary structure of the Labour Party was admittedly alleviated by the key role played by its affiliated trade unions in policy making, as well as candidate selection, leadership recruitment, campaigning, and more importantly, funding. Now this proved to be particularly important in the case of Scottish Labour, as the Scottish Trades Union Congress is not a regional branch of the Trades Union Congress, but an entirely autonomous body. Notwithstanding the historical importance of the Scottish trade union movement to Scottish Labour's sense of its past, the strength of Scottish trade unions has meant that local interests and networks have been highly influential in spite of the centralised organisation of the Labour Party and the subordinate role of its Scottish Executive Committee. This further empowered union leaders and created a relation of mutual interdependence between them. And the Scottish Labour Party's officials and Scottish Executive Committee, the latter benefiting from the generous funding supplied by union affiliation, and the electoral time donations and staffing that unions provided. In fact, not only did the unions pay affiliation fees, but they also frequently sponsored constituency candidates and sent officials to assist Labour in its campaigns for their entire duration. Now, in fact, the territorial distribution of material party resources constitutes a significant dimension of organizational power and of the capacity of sub-state parties to regulate their own affairs. The primary source of revenues for the Labour Party used to be the affiliation fees of the trade unions, which accounted for some 80 to 90% of the party's budget. These, however, came to constitute only half of the party's income after it undertook reforms in the 1990s to reduce its financial dependency on the trade unions and strove to attract individual and business donations. Although devolution facilitated access to extra resources for the Scottish Labour Party, control over the party's finances remained part of the British Labour Party's remit. Despite efforts to increase its shares, the Scottish Party is still overwhelmingly dependent on British funds, that is, on funds allocated by the Central Party organisation, as a majority of donors contribute to the statewide party rather than its sub-state branches. Support at statewide level is therefore essential for running electoral campaigns or managing the party's organisation. This has been particularly the case in recent years as Scottish Labour suffered a sharp drop in donations, first during Kezia Dugdale's leadership and especially during Richard Leonard's leadership, that is between 2017 and 2021. Well, the party collected donations of just under £600,000 in 2015, so when Kezia Dugdale was elected as leader. These fell to £100,000 in 2016, so a year later, and to just £35,000 in 2018. Now, by 2021, Scottish Labour's funds had become so dire that Anna Sarwar had to implement an emergency financial plan when he replaced Richard Leonard as leader on the 27th of February, admitting that the party's that the party had only been able to raise, wait for it, £250 through its fundraising. So obviously this means that the party slump in the polls mirrors a deterioration of its finances and a sharp loss of confidence among donors, particularly after the European referendum and Labour's ambivalent stance over Brexit. Now, the party's overall spending ahead of the May 2021 Scottish Parliament election was not far below that of the Scottish Conservatives or the SNP, actually. So suggesting that almost all of these funds actually come from the statewide party, from the constituency party. And so the Scottish Labour Party is highly dependent upon the statewide UK party, and may have few opportunities to diverge from the UK party line. Now, there is hope for Scottish Labour, however, as current leader Anna Sarwar has been able to operate a sharp turnaround in the party's finances and has very recently announced that he was able to raise over £1 million in donations. Nevertheless, the experience of the last few years underline Scottish Labour's reliance on financial support from the UK party and its subsequent difficulty to become more autonomous in terms of policy and personnel. Moreover, the party reforms undertaken by Labour in the 1990s seriously dented the strong position of the affiliated organisations as block voting was abolished in favour of the one-member, one-vote system. And their voting potential at party conferences was reduced to 50%, as much as the constituency parties. Now, with the National Party executive losing power to newly established policy committees dominated by the parliamentary leadership, there was a certain loosening of ties between party and unions, which changed internal power balances significantly. Now, this, of course, would be particularly acute in Scotland due to the strong influence of the unions, as it meant that the Labour Party's centralised structure was no longer moderated by the role played by affiliated organisations. By providing financial resources and manpower, as well as powerful local networks, the unions in Scotland have played a fundamental role in the party's long-standing hegemony. This is particularly true if we are, sorry, I went too fast, didn't I? It's particularly true if we are to consider the strikingly low membership of the Scottish Labour Party, in contrast with its past political strength. Labour membership has been consistently lower than anywhere else in Britain since the 1950s. Membership stood at some bit more than 16,000 in February 2021, when Anna Sawa became leader. So that corresponds to just 4% of the UK total. And this suggests that the mobilisation of ground troops, often for electoral canvassing and campaigning, often ran thin, and that for many years, Scottish Labour may have overlooked the key electoral functions of local parties, whose role in disseminating information, electoral targeting, and voter mobilisation have a strong impact on electoral performance. Scottish Labour's low membership levels therefore constitute a structural weakness, which can become especially relevant when it is in a challenging electoral position, such as is the case now, faced with the threat of particularly high mobilisation rates among nationalist members and supporters across Scotland. The SNP, I believe, is the third political party in the UK today in terms of membership, with I think 125,000 members in March 2021. I don't know if you have any more recent figures. And certainly it has attracted the support of many volunteers, groups and organisations during the independence referendum campaign, it is still able to mobilise ahead of elections to influence the vote. Furthermore, it has been argued that the low membership rate of the Scottish Labour Party finds a partial explanation in its dominance of local politics, which meant that the dissemination of a Labour message and the mobilisation of voters could be effectively managed by a small number of popular and well-respected local figures of the Labour Party, often councillors, in place of a large number of local party activists. Yet its stronghold over local government in Scotland brutally came to an end with the introduction of the single transferable vote system in 2007, when Labour's share of seats fell to 28.5%, and it was only able to win 2 councils. And its share of seats further fell to 21.6% in the last local elections of May 2017, when it won just 20% of the first preference votes and fell to 3rd place behind the Conservatives, who were on 25%. Now, these poor results stress the extent to which the first past the post system had been responsible for much of Labour's strength in Scotland over the years, by inflating the results of the party to such a degree and creating monopolies, or political monopolies, in urban Scotland and the west of Scotland in particular. The system had failed to represent the true popularity of the party in Scotland, and probably created few incentives for the party to strengthen its membership base, and renew with a vibrant political engagement. And however, the upcoming local council elections, which will be held next month, so on the 5th of May, could well offer an opportunity for Scottish Labour to regain the second place it lost to the Scottish Conservatives in 2017. It would appear that the Scottish Conservatives have not been immune from the damage done to their party's reputation with the Partygate scandals, and that, like its UK counterpart, the Scottish Labour Party, is now benefiting from a rise in opinion polls. So while an opinion poll of December 2021 showed a 5% lead for Labour over the Conservatives in Scotland, a more recent Survation poll published at the end of March has confirmed this trend and actually given Labour a 6% lead in Scotland. So if these trends were to be confirmed, Scottish Labour would be given an opportunity to replace the Conservatives as Scotland's main unionist party and lead the charge against the SNP's project for a second independence referendum. However, this unionist stance is at the heart of Labour's strategic dilemma, because it emphasises its British identity and narrows the pool of potential voters to those opposed to Scotland's independence. And as you'll see later on, Labour's experience of devolution so far has shown that the party has struggled to affirm a clear Scottish identity, and has subsequently been supplanted by the SNP as the party considered to best serve Scotland's interests. As the sole Scottish party with no UK counterpart, the SNP has indeed benefited from a unique position in Scotland's devolved landscape, which allowed it to argue that it was the only party that could speak for Scotland and defend its distinctive interests. And this, of course, has been key to winning over voters in Holyrood elections, which most voters anyway view as elections primarily concerned with Scottish issues, as opposed to Westminster elections, where wider UK concerns determine the basis of most people's votes. And perceptions of parties as being able to specifically defend Scottish interests are therefore paramount in Holyrood elections, and this has greatly advantaged the SNP. Scottish social attitude surveys have shown that between 71% and 75% of respondents believe that the SNP looked after Scotland's interests very closely or somewhat closely between 2001 and 2010, when the question was last asked. Besides, contrary to the main unionist parties whose cohorts of MSPs were relatively unknown before they were elected, the SNP's parliamentary force in Holyrood has always been high profile. When devolution was first introduced in 1999, the vast majority of senior Scottish Labour figures such as Gordon Brown, Robin Cook, or Alistair Darling, for instance, remained in Westminster. And so the Labour benches in Holyrood were thus filled with relatively inexperienced and uncharismatic MSPs. And in contrast, all 6 of the SNP's MPs decided to stand for a Scottish parliamentary seat in 1999. So this meant that Scottish Labour figures and leaders have suffered from a lack of recognition, while positive perceptions of SNP leadership and competence have been bolstered by the charisma and professionalism of senior SNP figures. And since well, the introduction of devolution, Scottish Labour has had to operate within a distinct Scottish institutional landscape, offered not only by the distinct characteristics, heritage of Scotland's past, but also by the different parliamentary and electoral models that were set up with the Scotland Act of 1998, notably the semi-proportional electoral system, which was adopted, the additional member system, which meant that there were more coalition governments, and that the Scottish Labour Party in coalition governments had to make some compromises with its coalition partners. This enabled the party to introduce the, most famously, the Graduation Endowment and Student Support Scotland Act in 2001 against the wishes of the party in Westminster. And so you could say that Labour Scottish governments have had to adapt to the new political landscape and take in consideration, to at least some degree, the opinions within Parliament and the wider Scottish public. This was a case, for example, with the introduction of free care to the elderly after the policy had been rejected outright by the Blair governments. However, it was only introduced after a bitter fight within the Scottish Labour Party itself. And so Scottish Labour's lack of autonomy remained obvious in the many instances when devolved, for example, and reserved matters overlapped, often through budgetary repercussions entailed by the Barnett formula. And this allowed the SNP to skillfully exploit these issues and present, you know, their party as champions of Scotland's interests. Now, after introducing devolution, Labour did take into account to at least some degree the need to decentralise some policy-making responsibilities. While responsibility for UK policy development was vested in the National Policy Forum, a new Scottish Policy Forum was created in 1998. Sorry, did I go too fast again? I'm getting lost. Sorry, was created in 1998 to propose and elaborate policy ideas and devolved matters, which would be subjected to the decision of the Scottish Conference, and if approved, could be added to the manifesto. If the Scottish Conference held a merely advisory function before devolution, it then became a sovereign body, determining by a 2/3 majority which devolved policy item could form part of the Scottish Labour Party's programme and perhaps be included in its manifesto. Yet the drafting of the manifesto remained the responsibility of a committee equally drawn from the Scottish Executive Committee and the Scottish Parliamentary Labour Group. So far from representing a bottom-up approach to policy, these changes thus implied a continuous top-down process involving the party leadership. Furthermore, reserved matters were still to be decided by the national policy procedures within the National Executive Committee, and Scottish Labour was allowed very little input with its modest contribution of 12 members out of a total of 180 in the National Policy Forum. Although the responsibility of candidate selection was entrusted to the Scottish Executive Committee for Holyrood selections, the National Executive Committee kept jurisdiction over all other candidate selections. Now, the relative autonomy of the Scottish Party was, as we've seen, alleviated by the material support of the UK Party, which became essential and which has tempered divergence in policy choices. And finally, the Scottish Party's lack of input on reserved matters and the fact that it was refrained from adopting official positions on these matters, such as was notably the case over the war in Iraq in 2003, meant that it has been unwittingly associated with unpopular policies in Scotland and considered closer to Westminster politics. Now, there were calls increasing calls under devolution for a more autonomous Scottish party in 2007, when D. Alexander first voiced these concerns. Indeed, a review of the Labour Party published proposals which were adopted in October 2011, which meant a certain degree of decentralisation for the Labour Party. These changes were followed by another agreement between Kezia Dugdale and Jeremy Corbyn in October 2015 for the further decentralisation of powers to Scottish Labour, which included full authority over all organisational and financial aspects, the selection of Westminster candidates, finally, and the right to formulate its own positions on reserved matters. Now, these changes appear to go in the right direction for Scottish Labour in their attempt to affirm their Scottish identity, but they perhaps proved a little too late and certainly insufficient in the polarised political environment that was created in the aftermath of the independence referendum. Scottish Labour only won, only won a single seat at 2 of the 3 last general elections, and lost another 2 seats in the May 2021 Scottish Parliament election, so totaling 22 seats. And the party suffered from a weak leadership under Richard Leonard, who the public had actually trouble recognising, and who had, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, rather poor opinion ratings throughout his leadership. And yet the multi-layered dimension of statewide parties with sub-state branches questions the importance of leadership and the assessment of a party, as it's not clear which leader most influences the vote or voters' behaviour. While Jeremy Corbyn, as you can see at the top of the screen, was more popular than Richard Leonard ahead of the June 2017 general election, when Labour did fare a little better in the polls, his popularity ratings plummeted in 2019, when up to 49% thought that he was doing very badly as leader of the Labour Party and 28% fairly badly. And Labour's electoral scores plummeted in 2019 as well. And on the other hand, if we are to consider, for example, the role played by Ruth Davidson with the Scottish Conservatives, we find that it was her leadership that was sort of a magnet for votes in Scotland. So it is difficult to say where the focus is and which leadership influences voters' behaviour, and this focus might shift from one to the other. Now, although Keir Starmer's popularity is still flatlining in Scotland, the election of Anna Sarwar as leader in February 2021 could nevertheless help the party improve its image. Although, as you can see, he has yet to make an impression on the public, he has managed to turn around the party's finances and is using the extra funds to improve the party's technological campaigning methods with a strong focus on the use of social media. In fact, he recently admitted in an interview to the New Statesman, I'll quote him, "We didn't have a digital operation worth the name. Finally, after 22 years of the 21st century, we have got the Scottish Labour Party into the 21st century." In a bid to emphasise his party's Scottish credentials, Sawa, so in a move that is very similar to that of the Scottish Conservatives a few years ago, Sawa also changed the party's logo of the red rose to a stylized thistle, a change which he says is aimed at two audiences: the voting public, who have come to consider the SNP as Scotland's natural party of government, and the Scottish Labour Party itself. And I'll quote him again. He said, "It demonstrates that we are a modern and fresh and autonomous future-looking party that is firmly on the side of Scotland. And it says to the party that we want to change the culture and the mindset. We have to believe we can win again." However, this has been made all the more difficult by the constitutional divide that cuts across Scotland's electorate. Now, firstly, the radical character of the pro-independence movement during the referendum debate in Scotland acted as a substitute to the kind of radicalism that attracted young activists back to Labour elsewhere in Britain, notably through the student fee protests south of the border, or the pro-Corbyn activist movement momentum. Scottish Labour initially failed to see a comparable increase of its membership after Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader of the Labour Party in September 2015, because the radical voice of the pro-independence movement during the independence referendum campaign, as well as in its aftermath, had already created a newly energised radical movement in its fold. In a nation where there are no student fees, the political awakening of young voters came not with the fees movement, but with the independence campaign. This means that Scottish Labour failed to renew its membership base and voter bases, as the young radical vote in Scotland had now defected to pro-independence parties, not least to the SNP, whose members below the age of 30 account for approximately 20% of its total membership, something like that. Secondly, exit polls after the referendum showed that the Yes movement has managed to capture much of Labour's traditional voter base. According to the Ashcroft and YouGov polls of September 2014, those in working class occupations were more likely to vote yes than those in middle class jobs. Those living in one of the 20% most deprived neighbourhoods voted yes, compared to just 60%. 65% of those living in one of the 20% most deprived neighbourhoods voted yes, compared to just 36% of those in the 1/5 most affluent. Sorry, I got confused there in the numbers. Moreover, some of the largest differences in support for independence were between renters and homeowners. Finally, Scottish Labour's position over the constitutional future of Scotland has plagued the party since the independence referendum of 2014. Scottish Labour's participation in the Better Together No campaign, alongside the two coalition government partners at the time, was damaging in two respects. First, because it stood on the same political platform as the Conservatives, and second, because of the negativity of the Better Together campaign. Although Labour launched its own initiative, United with Labour, in a bid to sort of distance itself from the coalition partners, and in particular from their austerity policies, the campaign was still being led by a senior Labour figure, Alistair Darling. So it became an easy target for the SNP, which could present the umbrella campaign as a Conservative-led initiative, which gathered three British rather than Scottish parties and generally defended austerity policies and welfare cuts. Furthermore, given the position of the Better Together campaign as the defender of the status quo, it had trouble departing from what could generally be considered as a negative stance. As the challenger, the SNP was able to lead a much more inspiring campaign and deliver a positive message about the future of an independent Scotland. So inevitably, criticism formed the core of the Better Together campaign. This represented a clear change of tone for Labour, as it was once associated with a positive case for constitutional reform. Constitutional change was New Labour's flagship policy in Scotland, and it was a new Labour government that delivered a Scottish Parliament. So, as Henderson et al. Note, it now stands as a party advocating against change. Now, not only does this rarely lend itself to inspiring and impassioned politics, but Labour's added difficulty is that it has to vie with the competition of two other opponents of independence, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. Now, Labour's calls for change are perhaps less inspiring because they are less radical and cautiously incremental. In an attempt to revive its past reforming spirit and offer a midway solution between that of the SNP's independence and the Conservatives' status quo, the party has been renewing its calls to extend devolution and perhaps lead the UK to some type of federal constitutional arrangement, a solution often called Devo Max. Now, this is a usual reflex with the party, as it has attempted to tackle the rise to power of the nationalists with gradual extensions to the Scottish Parliament's powers since 2007. This was the case, for instance, with the setting up of the Calman Commission, which devolved further powers to Scotland's Parliament with the Scotland Act of 2012, or even to Ed Miliband's commitment in the Vow, published in the Daily Record, just on the eve of the 2014 referendum, which led ultimately to the Scotland Act of 2016. Gordon Brown has today taken the lead of a Labour Commission on the Constitution, which, I quote, will focus on delivering real and lasting economic and political devolution should a Labour government be elected. Now, although Brown promises radical reforms, these will inevitably fail to be as radical as those proposed by independence supporters in Scotland. And the timing of Labour's report may be problematic if it is published as the SNP government is planning a second independence referendum. And besides, Devo Max, as you can see on the slides, now enjoys little support or little enthusiasm, really, in Scotland. Comres polls published between January and March of this year show that between 32 and 35% of respondents think Devo Max is a good compromise, as opposed to 27 to 39% who think it is a bad compromise. And similarly, slightly more people were strongly or somewhat opposed to Devo Max, so between 30 and 31%, than strongly or somewhat supported that option, so between 26 and 29%, with many, in fact, people neither opposing nor supporting this option. Now, the main problem encountered by Labour in Scotland is that the two main constitutional options, independence and the status quo, are owned by the SNP and the Conservatives. While only 7% of yes supporters trust Labour most to campaign for Scottish independence, quite obviously, only 20% of no supporters trust Labour most to defend the Union, as opposed to 55% who trust the Conservatives most. And this was amply demonstrated at the 2015 general election, when the salience and popularity of independence had dramatically increased following the referendum. And enthusiasm for independence trumped traditional loyalties to the Scottish Labour Party and produced a massive swing and switch of partisan allegiance from Labour to the SNP. No voters, however, were much less affected by the referendum and continued to divide along traditional class, regional and religious lines between Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. So the first past the post system therefore gives a major advantage to the SNP, as a united independence vote is more likely to win over a divided unionist one. Brexit, however, has further complicated the situation. Now, first, Labour's image suffered because Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was criticised for the timidity of its pro-European stance in the months leading to the referendum, not least because 62% of voters voted Remain, and where the Remain vote won a majority across all regions of Scotland. So this gave a new advantage to the SNP as the leading advocate of Remain. The Brexit vote renewed calls for a second independence referendum and gave credence to the SNP's long-standing position on an independent Scotland in the EU. Scottish Labour has therefore found it difficult to provide a satisfactory solution to the majority of Unionist and Remain voters. And the party is now caught between its Unionist and pro-EU positions, having to argue that Labour is the only party to stand both for unionism and membership of the EU, and combine its two new conflicting legitimacies as a unionist and pro-EU party. Although the Brexit vote has or initially divided yes voters, as some of them had voted to leave the EU, this did not come, as you can see, as a particular advantage to Labour, as the Scottish electorate was now split in 4 rather than 2 groups. And as this first table suggests, the SNP and the Conservatives were still picking up most of the votes in the issues they owned. So yes Remain, for the SNP, no Leave for the Scottish Conservatives, 69%. The SNP was still able to attract some support from yes Leavers, 58%, whose identification with the independence cause took precedence over their views on EU membership. The largest group in Scotland, though, is the No Remainers, as it represents approximately 1/3 of the electorate. Now, in 2017, Labour was still able to attract 42% of them, and the rest were divided between the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and the SNP. However, the trends were further entrenched by December 2019, with a further polarisation of the Yes Remain voters flocking to the SNP, so that's 88%, as you can see, and No Leave voters remaining in the fold of the Conservative Party, 67%. No Remain voters, however, were this time evenly split between the 4 main parties, and Labour's share of the vote fell in this group to 29%. In fact, Labour fared worse in 2019 among all groups, and this table, is it not the next one? Yes, and the next table showing stated reasons for voter choice appears to suggest that the main reasons were linked to the party's policies and leadership. They drop in the number of people believing Labour had the best leader, could give some hope to the party now that it has changed both of its leaders. But more worrying is the number of people who voted tactically. Indeed, a certain amount of tactical voting was apparent with unionist voters who preferred to vote for the best placed unionist party in their constituency. and with pro-independence voters who favour the Greens on the regional list vote. Now, tactical voting occurred in constituencies where the SNP was pitted against one of the main unionist parties in a tight race. So that suggests, of course, that the main driver behind votes was indeed the debate over a second independence referendum. And sadly for the party, its policies have determined most of its voter choices in the last general elections, and it scores rather highly in polls measuring the trust voters have in each party's ability to manage health, education, or social justice. And yet, Scottish Labour's plummeting electoral scores are a clear indication that the partisan electoral strategies of the UK Labour Party are no longer suitable for a Scottish Labour Party having to survive in the landscape, in the political landscape marked by a constitutional divide. So it will have to find a fine compromise between its conflicting loyalties as a unionist pro-European Labour Party if it is to become Scotland's leading party again. Thank you.